final presentation is about a best practice manual that for managing litter that we're currently working on at Integrity Ag. So this project is basically trying to bring together a whole bunch of work from all over the place. So obviously what we're after here is some best management practices to manage the litter right through the production cycle certainly for the birds, and to ensure efficient production, get good welfare outcomes and so forth. So as I said, there's a lot of work from both Australia and internationally outlining what we would call best practice for managing litter in the sheds and spent litter, particularly in those two areas. But sort of this dearth of information around chicken litter is often a bit hard to access or hard to understand format to users. And one of the problems with it, I suppose, it focuses on a single issue. So one of the things might be about fresh bedding, but that then doesn't actually deal with the issue of how you might end up utilising it in the paddock later on, or stuff dealing with it in the shed might not have any thoughts of the same thing about how it can be used as spent litter later on, or how you might want to generate energy from it. So trying to bring that information together in a manual regarding litter management, and sort of try and develop it around, I won't go into it too much, but sort of get it in a format that Agrifutures are after for a lot of these best practice guides that we're working on. So it can be basically used in a web format later on. We want to put a troubleshooting guide in it, and certainly some information on managing the 4 main litter types that I talked about that are used in Australia early on. So currently what we're working on, improvement in litter management leading to better bird performance and lower operational costs. So that's what our goal is with this best practice guide. Obviously longer term, it may get adopted more basically, such as through audits or whatever, or state regulators assessing things. So we obviously want to get this thing right. Aim to achieve the following outcomes for industry by developing these management guides through improved access to the knowledge regarding best management practice for litter, improved litter management and bird performance by implementing those practices, and also, lowering environmental impact. So if we can get good litter management inside the shed and after it's taken out of the shed to reduce odour emissions, we're improving the litter quality. Obviously, moisture is a big thing to do with that Mark's just talked about. We can reduce those amenity impacts on neighbours, which obviously from an industry perspective gives a better perception for the industry. So the outputs from this summarise the knowledge around best management practice. Obviously get the best science available, so certainly sift through all the literature and the other best management practices that people have come up with over the decades from around the world. And aim to improve litter management, providing the operators with this best available science and guidance. So the steps of this, review and consult industry regarding best management practices in litter. So obviously this has flowed on a bit from the earlier work that Kalinda and Steve did on litter and covering things like litter reuse and the sorts of litter they use. And develop a best practice guide covering everything basically. So not just dealing with what's in the shed, but right through for selection and sourcing, where I talked about earlier about the different litter types. So getting that clean bedding material. Right through the utilisation of it, whereas it might be used on pastoral crops or generate energy from. As I mentioned, a troubleshooting guide and certainly some issues of how you might go about managing the different litter types. Review and gain impact from key stakeholders and industry experts on it as well. So we've collated that information. It's, obviously a bit of a challenge because we've got to consider the requirements of growers, processors and third parties. So the definition of best practice might be something a bit different to all of those. So bringing all that information together and considering best practice from a range of perspectives and stakeholders. The other thing we obviously want to do, as I sort of briefly touched on, is we're also developing a national environmental and planning guideline for mid-chicken farm development. So this being another guide, and we obviously want it to align with it, but try and present this in a similar format. So these things are basically happening in line with each other this year, and hopefully they'll both be available sometime early in 2021. So what should be happening shortly. So we've developed up some draft chapters that are getting internally reviewed at the moment. And then we're going to send them out for some national and international experts. So people overseas, and yes, obviously Mark will be included in that with his knowledge of litter. And we're also looking for feedback from other stakeholders. So I've got this audience of 63 other participants there. I'd certainly, if you want to get in contact with me and have a look at this best practice manual, provide some input into it, I wouldn't mind putting together a bit of an industry reference group as well of a few people to run this by as well. Certainly people from different parts of industry. So what we want to do from the review, identify areas that need to be strengthened or modified, take all the feedback on board and revise it. And then, finally in the process, it'll be reviewed when it goes to Agrifutures as well. So there's certainly a review process and stuff that will happen with the document from where it is at the moment. So just to lay out the document, so it's currently got 11 chapters in it. That may change depending on what people think when they review it. Right through from litter selection, as I said, sourcing it, litter pre-treatment, so obviously a chapter on the stuff that Mark just talked about. Big one, obviously, shed heating and cooling system, so managing the litter in the shed, so chapter 5 and 6 cover that a fair bit. Also got one on caking and tillage. I suppose some people think that caking is, once you've got it, it's not best practice, but inevitably things can go wrong and you still need to be able to manage it, manage that caking and how you deal with it. So there's a chapter on that. Pests and diseases, litter clean out after you've finished with it. Certainly on litter reuse, which has been discussed a fair bit today. So the way you go about doing that, the practices you need to put in place to get that litter to work best for you, how to reduce the ammonia levels in it as well. Spent litter utilisation as well, the final chapter. So you probably can't necessarily read that, but that's just detailing a bit more of each of those 11 chapters, what goes into it, some background material on it. Certainly on the litter type selection, looking at the contaminants, so that's certainly including the stuff we've learnt from our risk assessment project in there as well. Sourcing it, so litter treatment and additives. So I said, yes, so how you prepare it, how you might want to add those litter additives, so including some of the information in there that Mark was talking about. Shed ventilation, cooling, so how you go about reducing ammonia, particularly ammonia levels in the shed, managing odour and dust in the shed. Big one, obviously, chapter 6, which is fairly important, how you go about managing litter inside the shed. And treating it, managing it, tilling it. Chapter I said on caking, pests, the clean out process, certainly on litter reuse, the bit of information from an earlier project on the things to do with practical and certainly the economic considerations of it, which Mark presented that information as well just before. Spent litter utilisation, so there's a fair bit of information on there on the composition on litter, probably put an appendix together there, I think, so if people can hand out that information to end users on, what it's likely to contain and so forth. A bit on the energy recovery, so, what's the heating value of litter, what things to look out for if you say you want to anaerobically digest it as well. As I said before, there's some appendices in there on troubleshooting and how to go about managing common litters. So one thing you'll notice at the end of all these chapters is a guide. So each of them has the technical information and then a guide at the end of it. So that's a bit of an example there. We won't cover it. That's tillage to caking. So it covers what's in the literature as part of that. And then that at the end of each chapter, we actually have these guides. So I've just put a couple of examples up there: shed heating and a cooling guide, and a managing wet or cake litter guide. So, and all these are got the same format at the end of each chapter. So a performance goal, description, the things you need to consider, and then that's some of the best management practices. And we'll split these up. So the ventilation one, shed heating and cooling, certainly talks about the ventilation process in there, what you want to monitor and record. And obviously some best management practices there around wet and cake litter there. So that probably covers it off on that. So thanks to Agrifutures for that, and thank you again for such a big audience participating in today. And as I said, my contact details up there, and if you want to shoot me any questions, or if people are interested in getting involved in this reference group, yeah, get in contact with me.